It was a cold evening, and the sky was heavy with dark clouds. The streets were almost empty, with only the sound of heavy rain falling on the ground. People hurried to get home, hiding under umbrellas, trying to avoid the storm. In the middle of that weather, a man walked alone with his coat pulled tightly around him. His face looked tired, not just from the long day, but from years of carrying loneliness on his shoulders. He lived most of his life in silence, with no family waiting at home, no voice to greet him when he opened the door. Every evening felt the same quiet, empty, and without warmth. As he made his way through the rain, he suddenly stopped. On the side of the road, near the corner of a small shop that had closed early, he saw two little figures sitting close together. The rain poured down on them, but they did not move. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But then he looked closer. Two girls, no older than 10 or 11, were huddled together under a thin piece of cloth that was already soaked through. Their small bodies trembled in the cold, and their faces were pale with fear and hunger. For a moment, he stood frozen. His heart tightened at the sight, but his mind filled with questions. Who were they? Where were their parents? Why were they left outside like this in such terrible weather? He looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the street was empty. No one stopped, no one cared. People rushed past, too focused on their own lives. The man took a small step closer, then stopped again. He had lived alone for so long that he was unsure if he was ready to involve himself in something so big. Caring for children was not simple. He thought about his small home, about his limited income, about the quiet life he was used to. What could he possibly give them? He had nothing special, no riches, no large house. All he had was a heart that had been aching in silence for years. But then he saw one of the girls lift her face. Her eyes met his, wide and frightened, and it was as if time stood still. The look in her eyes was not just fear, it was also a silent plea for help. She was too tired to cry, too cold to speak, but her eyes told him everything. Something deep inside him shifted. He remembered his own childhood, the feeling of being unseen, the emptiness of having no one to rely on. He couldn't walk away. Slowly he knelt down in front of them. His voice was gentle as he spoke, though the rain almost drowned out his words. He told them not to be afraid, that he only wanted to help. At first, the girls pulled back, holding onto each other tightly, unsure if they could trust him. They had already seen enough of the world's cruelty to know that strangers could be dangerous. But the man's face carried no harshness, only sincerity. He took off his coat and wrapped it around their shivering bodies. The warmth surprised them. One of the girls finally whispered something too soft for him to hear, but it was enough to break the wall between them. He reached out his hand slowly, and after a long moment, one of the girls placed her small freezing fingers in his. The other followed, leaning against him for comfort. With careful steps, he guided them away from the corner of the street. The rain continued to pour, but he no longer noticed it. The only thing he could think about was keeping these children safe. As they walked toward his home, doubts still whispered in his mind. Was he doing the right thing? Could he really take responsibility for them? What if he failed? But then he looked down at the two little girls holding tightly onto him as if he was their only hope. At that moment, the questions didn't matter anymore. When they reached his small house, he quickly unlocked the door and brought them inside. The warmth of the room wrapped around them, and the girls looked around in silence, still unsure if they were allowed to be there. He hurried to bring them towels, blankets, and something hot to drink. The girls sat quietly on the old couch, holding the mugs with both hands, their eyes following him everywhere he moved. They were still cautious, still afraid, but their shivers began to ease. The man watched them as they sipped slowly, and his heart softened even more. For years, his home had been nothing but walls and silence. Tonight it felt different. Tonight, the silence was broken not by noise, but by the presence of two souls who had nowhere else to go. As the girls leaned against each other, fighting sleep, he realized he could no longer imagine turning them away. That night, something changed forever. He had opened his door out of pity, but what grew inside him was more than that. It was the beginning of love, fragile but real. And though he didn't know what the future would hold, one thing was certain: he was no longer alone. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside that small home, 3 lives had just taken a new path, one that would lead them from loneliness toward something far greater. The next morning began quietly, with the soft light of dawn slipping through the curtains. The man woke early, as he always did, but this time something felt different. His small house was no longer empty. In the next room, 2 little girls were still asleep, curled under the blankets he had given them. For a moment, he stood in the doorway watching them. Their faces looked peaceful now, far from the fear and cold of the night before. He realized then that he had made the right choice. Even though he had no idea what challenges would come, he knew he couldn't let them go back to the streets. He went into the kitchen and made a simple breakfast: warm porridge, bread, and tea. He wasn't used to cooking for anyone else, and his hands trembled a little as he worked. When the smell drifted through the house, the girls slowly stirred. They looked around, almost surprised to see they were still safe. He called them gently to the table. At first, they hesitated, but hunger overcame their shyness, and soon they sat quietly, eating with small, careful bites. He didn't push them to talk. He just let them eat in peace. Knowing trust could not be built in a single night. As days turned into weeks, life began to change. The man had lived alone for so long that having children in his home felt strange at first. He learned quickly that they needed more than food and shelter. They needed care, patience, and the feeling of belonging. The girls were cautious, still holding back as if they feared they might be abandoned again. Sometimes they would wake in the night crying softly, and he would sit near their bed until they fell asleep again. Slowly, the walls around their little hearts began to crack. The man wasn't wealthy, and his life had always been modest. He worked long hours just to cover his own expenses, and now there were 2 more mouths to feed. He cut back on his own needs, giving up small comforts to make sure the girls had enough. There were times when he came home tired, his back aching, but seeing the children waiting for him made the weariness feel lighter. He began to look forward to their laughter, their small voices filling the house that had once been so silent. There were struggles, of course. He had no idea how to braid hair or how to help with schoolwork beyond the basics. Some evenings he sat with them at the old wooden table, struggling along with their lessons. Other times he asked neighbors for help, slowly creating a small circle of support. The girls noticed these efforts. They noticed how he gave his best, even when he didn't have much to give. They noticed how he never raised his voice, even when things were hard. Little by little, they started to trust him not just as the man who saved them, but as someone who cared deeply. One day, while they were eating dinner, the younger girl set down her spoon and whispered a single word: "Father." The man froze, his heart pounding. For a moment he thought he had misheard, but then she repeated it, louder this time. The older sister looked at him too, her eyes full of something he had never seen before: acceptance. It was the first time they had called him that. The man could barely hold back tears. His whole life had been marked by silence, but in that moment, one word broke it all. From that day forward, their bond grew stronger. The girls began to laugh more often, filling the small house with warmth. They started bringing him little drawings from school, small notes that said thank you, and flowers they picked from the side of the road. Neighbors who had once seen him as the quiet, lonely man now saw someone different, a father walking proudly with 2 daughters by his side. The change was clear to everyone. Still, the man carried doubts inside him. He wondered if he was truly enough for them, if they would ever wish for a better life than the one he could provide. But whenever he saw them smile, whenever they reached for his hand as they walked down the street, He knew he was giving them something more valuable than wealth. He was giving them love, stability, and a home where they belonged. The once empty house was now alive with footsteps and laughter. The man was no longer just surviving each day in silence. He was living with purpose, shaping two young lives and finding his own heart healed in the process. The storm that had brought them together was long gone, but what grew afterward was something stronger, something lasting. They were no longer three strangers brought together by chance. They were becoming a family. The years slowly passed, and with them came many trials that tested the strength of their small family. Life was not easy. The man worked long days, sometimes taking 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and pay for school fees. He sacrificed simple pleasures for himself, new clothes, warm meals, even rests, so the girls would never have to go without. His hands grew rough, his shoulders heavy, but he never once complained. Each sacrifice felt worth it the moment he saw the girls smiling or heard them laugh together. But challenges came in ways he could not always control. There were days when money ran low, and he worried about how to stretch every coin. Sometimes he came home late at night, tired and hungry, but still forced a smile so the girls would not see his exhaustion. On cold evenings, he would go without supper, quietly letting them eat the last portions so they wouldn't feel the sting of hunger. They never realized it then, but years later, they would remember those small acts of love. The girls also had their struggles. At school, other children whispered about their past, about being abandoned, and sometimes they came home with tears in their eyes. The man listened patiently, comforting them in the only way he knew by reminding them they were not alone anymore. He told them they were his daughters, and nothing anyone said could change that. His words gave them strength, and slowly they began to carry themselves with more confidence. There were moments of doubt that weighed heavily on him. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he sometimes asked himself if he was truly enough for them. Could he guide them into a better future? Could he protect them from the pain of the world? He feared failing them, feared that his love might not cover all their needs. But each time those thoughts darkened his mind, he would glance at the small room where the girls slept peacefully. Their faces were calm, their breaths soft and steady. And in those moments, he found his answer. He might not be perfect, but he was present. And that mattered most. As the girls grew older, they began to understand more of what he had given up for them. They noticed the worn-out shoes he kept wearing year after year. They noticed how his hands were always tired and rough, proof of long hours of work. One evening, as they all sat at the table doing homework together, the older girl suddenly looked at him and said, "One day, I'll study hard and make you proud." The younger one nodded, adding that she too would help him when she grew older. The man's eyes filled with tears at their words. He quickly turned his face away so they wouldn't see, but his heart swelled with quiet pride. Life had its share of hard days. There were times when illness struck, and he found himself torn between going to work or staying home to care for them. Each decision weighed on him, but he never allowed the girls to see his worries. To them, he was steady as a rock, a source of comfort they could always lean on. They began to trust him fully, not just as the man who had rescued them from the rain, but as the father who would never leave their side. And yet, in the middle of all these struggles, there was also joy. Small moments carried the weight of happiness. The sound of their laughter as they played outside, the pride in his heart when they brought home good grades, the evenings when they sat together and shared stories. Sometimes the girls would surprise him with little drawings or notes that said, "We love you." He kept those small treasures tucked away in a box, pulling them out on nights when he felt tired and overwhelmed. One night, after a particularly hard day at work, he returned home to find the girls waiting with a meal they had managed to cook themselves. It wasn't perfect. The bread was a little burnt, and the soup too salty, but to him it tasted better than anything he had ever eaten. He realized then that they were no longer just children who needed saving. They were becoming young women who understood love, sacrifice, and gratitude. As time moved on, their bond only deepened. The man still faced doubts, still wondered about the future, but the truth was clear. They had become his reason to keep moving forward. Every hardship, every sleepless night, every sacrifice was no longer a burden but a gift he gave freely, because he had something worth living for. The lonely man who once walked in silence had found his purpose. 15 years slipped by faster than anyone could have imagined. The two little girls who once trembled in the rain had grown into confident young women, full of dreams and determination. They had worked hard in school, carried the lessons their father taught them, and were now stepping into the world with their own paths. The man, now older, often sat in his small living room, staring at the photographs on the wall, pictures of birthdays, school ceremonies, and quiet family moments that had filled the once empty house with life. He was proud, deeply proud, but his body had begun to slow down. His back ached more often, and his hands no longer carried the same strength they once had. Though he still smiled when the girls came to visit, there were times when the loneliness of their absence pressed against his heart again. They were adults now, busy with work and studies, and the house had started to return to its old silence. Yet this silence felt different from before. It wasn't heavy with emptiness, it was filled with memories, love, and a quiet satisfaction that he had given them a life they deserved. What he didn't know was that his daughters had been planning something special. They had grown not just in age but in gratitude. Every sacrifice, every tear he had hidden, every meal he had given them before himself had left a mark on their hearts. They wanted to show him that they had not forgotten. So they decided to honor him in a way he could never expect. One cool evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the man sat at home sipping tea. He thought about the past, about that night long ago when he found the two girls huddled in the rain. His chest tightened with both pain and joy. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. He stood slowly, his joints aching, and opened it. Standing there were two young women, dressed neatly, their faces glowing with pride and emotion. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. They were no longer the fragile children he once carried in his arms. They stood tall, with eyes full of strength, but those same eyes still carried the softness he remembered from years ago. The girls smiled, and before he could speak, they stepped forward and embraced him tightly. The man's hands shook as he held them. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he whispered that he had missed them more than words could say. They told him they had come not just to visit, but to thank him. They had prepared something that would let the world know about the man who had once been lonely, who had chosen love over fear, and who had given two abandoned children a future. The man looked confused, unsure of what they meant, but the excitement in their voices filled the room. Over the next few days, the daughters arranged everything. They reached out to old neighbors, teachers, and friends, people who had watched their story unfold from the beginning. They shared memories, collected words of admiration, and planned a tribute that would not only honor their father, but also inspire others. The man, unaware of the full scope of what was happening, simply sat quietly, moved by their presence and the way they took charge with confidence. The day of the gathering arrived. The daughters brought him to a community hall decorated with simple flowers and photos from their childhood. As he walked in, he froze. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who remembered his struggles, teachers who had seen the girls grow, friends who had watched his quiet sacrifices. Everyone stood and applauded as he entered, and for a moment he didn't understand why. His daughters guided him to the front, their hands gripping his tightly. They looked at him with tears in their eyes and said, "This is for you." The man's heart pounded as he realized what they had done. He had never asked for recognition. He had never expected gratitude. All he ever wanted was to give those girls a chance at life. But here he was, standing before a room full of people, being honored for the very love he had given without hesitation. That night, he cried openly for the first time in years. The lonely man who once lived in silence now stood in the middle of a room filled with love, respect, and admiration. His daughters had not only grown into women of strength, but had also carried his love forward into everything they did. The hall was quiet for a moment, and then the elder daughter stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry through the room. She began to tell their story. She spoke about the night long ago when two frightened little girls sat in the rain, abandoned and hopeless. She told everyone how one man, who had nothing more than a small home and a kind heart, had stopped when others walked by. She said he wrapped them in his coat, gave them food, and gave them something they thought they would never have again, a family dot. As she spoke, the younger daughter stood beside her, nodding through tears. She added her own words, telling how he had stayed awake during their fevers, worked long hours to keep them clothed and fed, and sacrificed everything so they would never feel unwanted again. He gave us love, she said, when the world had given us nothing. The man sat in the front row, his hands trembling as he listened. He had never thought of himself as a hero. To him, it was simple. He had done what his heart told him to do. But hearing their voices, seeing the faces of the people who applauded with every word, he realized that his small choices had created something much bigger than himself. The girls then invited him to stand. They presented him with a framed picture. It was of the three of them together, taken years earlier on their first family outing. Below the picture, words were written in bold, "From lonely to loved our father, our hero." The man pressed a hand against his chest, overwhelmed by the weight of it. His eyes filled with tears, and for once, he did not try to hide them. The audience stood and clapped, many with tears in their eyes. Some remembered how quiet and distant he used to be, how people barely noticed him before the girls came into his life. Now they saw him surrounded by love and respect, honored not for wealth or power, but for kindness and sacrifice. The daughters each took his hand, guiding him to the center of the hall. "This is the man who changed our lives," they said together. The applause grew louder, echoing against the walls. The man felt as though time had folded in on itself. He remembered the storm, the rain, the fear in their eyes that night so many years ago. And now, standing here, he saw those same eyes shining with love and gratitude. Later that evening, as the gathering ended, neighbors and friends came up to him, thanking him for his example. They said his story had touched them, reminding them that even the smallest act of compassion could change the course of someone's life. The man shook his head humbly, saying he had only done what anyone with a heart should do. But deep down, he finally accepted something he had never allowed himself to believe. He had given those girls a future, and in return, they had given him back a life filled with meaning. Back at home, the daughters sat with him at the old wooden table. They cooked his favorite meal, laughing and telling stories late into the night. The man listened, smiling softly. For years he had worried about whether he was enough, whether he had truly done right by them. Tonight, those doubts melted away. He no longer felt the weight of loneliness. Instead, he felt the warmth of love that had come full circle. Before going to bed, the younger daughter hugged him tightly and whispered, "You will never be alone again." The elder added, "We are here because of you, and we will always be your daughters." The man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink deep into his heart. He had lived most of his life believing he was just another quiet soul passing through the world. Now he understood that he had created something lasting, something greater than himself. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought of the journey. The storm, the fear, the sacrifices, the laughter, and finally, the honor. He realized love had been the thread holding it all together. What began as a simple act of kindness on a rainy night had turned into a story of family, of belonging, and of transformation. The man who once lived in silence was now remembered not for what he lacked, but for the love he gave. And that love would echo far beyond his lifetime, carried in the hearts of the two girls who would forever call him father.